Hello everyone, and welcome to the first devlog for my new game, Zap Squad. Now what is Zap Squad? Zap Squad is a top-down shoot-'em-up focusing on teamwork, base management, and communication, where players compete against AI enemies or face off against one another. The core mechanic of the game revolves around each team's zappers, which are basically stations for charging electrical energy used up by the team throughout the match. The team must focus on using and protecting these generators in order to restock on ammo, use abilities more effectively, and other elements essential to gaining victory. Essentially, it's going to be an attack and defense style game where each player must defend and use their own zapper stations to help their team win, and each player will be broken down into subclasses, like a commander who manages the team, an electrician who focuses on repairing the zappers, and infantrymen who focus on damage output. So we have more things like game modes and other ideas planned out, which I'm gonna go over in a future video, but today I'm just going over kind of how I started the development of the game. Okay, so the first thing I did was go into an image editor and create two sprites, one gun sprite and one player sprite. Now, with my limited skills in pixel art, I think they actually turned out pretty well. I like how the gun looks, just a basic sci-fi blaster, and the player is an astronaut, which is based off an idea I have for a map, which is basically on a spaceship and astronauts are trying to stop other astronauts from boarding. So I just went into GameMaker and threw together a basic prototype with some basic movement and collisions and a gun which would rotate around and fire where the mouse was pointing. I also added in a little flip at 90 and 270 so the gun was never upside down. And the next thing I did was go into a script and change how the player faces. I thought it looked weird that the player wouldn't be looking in the direction the gun was pointing, so just with a few lines of code I could change that. And to make it so that the player was always looking where he was firing, I also changed it so that the player would not flip direction when he's walking if he's firing, because I thought it would look pretty weird if he was walking to the right and firing to the left and he's not even looking there. So as we can see here, whenever the gun flips, the player flips, and when he's walking and firing, he doesn't change direction no matter which direction he's moving. So we got that working good. Now after I had the movement and the aiming of the gun figured out, the next thing I wanted to do was add in some animations. So I went into my sprite editor once again. I'm using Piskel here just because it's cloud-based, so if I decide to, when I go to college, if I bring a different computer with me, I still have all the files that I created. Just in case something goes wrong, I think having an online backup is good. But basically what I was doing was just creating a walking animation for the player. I tried to do it, and we can see how that turned out, which isn't great. So instead I just threw together a really basic one where his feet kind of just hop up and down, nothing fancy, and I'm gonna have to change it later, but I didn't have the patience to create a good looking animation, so it's definitely on my top of my to-do list for now. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to do was create a basic enemy AI. So what I did was create a grid, an invisible grid behind the room which can help the enemy to navigate. Now basically this enemy is going to be a basic enemy which I can use as a parent for all future enemies, which will just speed up the process because I can just change some few behaviors to make each enemy work. So the first approach I did to this was create an enumerator with the different states listed out and then use a switch statement and some conditionals to switch between each of these states. And after that I went into the implementation of the idle state and the chase state, which you can see here. Basically what it does is I have two variables, px and py, which represent the player's location centered in a cell on the grid. And then I use GameMaker's built-in path functions to help the enemy navigate to the player's position. Now this approach did kind of work. As you can see here, I walk towards the enemy, and once it gets close enough, the enemy will start following me. However, I had some issues with this. Some of the collisions with the enemy in the boxes weren't quite processing well, and I couldn't get the attack state to work at all. There's also this weird bug where if I wasn't in a closed off grid, the enemy would kind of just lose which direction I was in and start freaking out. So to fix this, I completely changed my approach. So the next approach I focused on was creating multiple different scripts for each of the enemy states and a few helper scripts to help me choose when to switch in between these states, which including checking for the player and using random integers to decide whether or not to move when it was in the wander state. So as you can see here, I zoomed out the view just so you can see the enemy's behavior more clearly, but it has an idle state here where each step it'll choose whether or not to stay still or move around, and it'll kind of just wander aimlessly in place until it senses the player. Now it can sense the player through objects as long as it is close enough to it. In the moment that it senses the player, it can solve a maze and do some basic pathfinding to get where the player is. Now the enemy is slower than the player, so the player can hypothetically outrun it, and it can still kind of trick it by going through some things, and the moment the player gets out of range, it loses, it stops chasing and it goes right back into the wander state after a set period. So the next logical step after creating enemy pathfinding was to create the attack state for the enemy. So what I did was to create an enemy attack state script, which basically created a damage object, which was responsible for handling knockback and applying damage to the player. And I also modified my other scripts to allow the attack state to be reached once he was close enough to the player. Now, the next thing I did was just create the sprite for the damage object. It doesn't really matter what it is or what color necessarily. I just figured that a circle would be most effective, because I don't think a square damage one would be great. I figure a circle is kind of fits the right size when put in a 32 by 32 sprite. And after I created the sprite for the damage object, I created the object itself, and then I went into its collision with the player, and I tried to create a sort of knockback system where it would get an X force and a Y force based off a vector which is related to the direction the player is from the enemy, and a knockback value which I could manually change depending on enemies. So I think I use a value of 10, but as was seen, I played around with this for a while and it was kind of just broken. Like as you can see right there, he just flew off screen.
In their tongue, he is Dovahkiin, Dragonborn.
But after all of this, I realized I'm a big Dumbo. Yeah, it's what I'm most familiar with, but using Game Maker Studio might not be the best decision for this game. I mean, it lost support in July 2018, and I need to be using something newer, something that's actively updated and has more robust recent features. So I decided to switch to Unity. I was going to start the project from scratch and make it all over in Unity. It was going to be great, but then I realized I'm garbage at Unity, and just getting used to the switch to C# and the different UI was really annoying. So being the perseverant man that I am, I promptly went back to Game Maker and added a smooth view, which actually looks pretty neat. Take a look.